Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales. Before we begin, take a moment to settle yourself comfortably where you are, letting the weight of the day release from your shoulders and allowing your breathing to find its own gentle, easy rhythm, slower than you might have noticed it was just moments ago. And as you continue to breathe in this quiet, natural way, you might notice how your body begins to feel heavier against whatever surface supports you, as though you're sinking just slightly into a place of perfect rest, and there is nothing at all that requires your attention right now, nothing that cannot wait until tomorrow, nothing except the simple pleasure of listening to these words as they flow past you like water in a stream, steady and undemanding, and you need not hold on to any of them or remember them or even follow them with perfect attention, because the story itself will carry you forward without any effort on your part. And all you need to do is allow yourself to drift along with it, feeling the muscles around your eyes growing softer, the tension in your jaw releasing, your tongue resting gently against the floor of your mouth, and perhaps your eyelids are already growing heavier, or perhaps they will close in their own time, and either way is perfectly fine because this is a time only for rest and quietness and the slow descent into peaceful sleep. The workshop stood in a narrow street not far from Smithfield, where the buildings leaned close together and the cobblestones caught the lamplight from the shop windows in uneven patterns of gleam and shadow. By day, the street carried the sound of cart wheels and the calls of vendors, the bustle of apprentices hurrying between the printing houses and stationers. But evening had drawn that noise away, leaving only the occasional footstep of someone passing homeward and the distant settling sounds of the city preparing itself for night. The bookbinder's workshop occupied the ground floor of a three-story building whose upper rooms were let to a family of clerks, and the front window, though narrow, gave out onto the street with glass that had been polished that morning and would be polished again tomorrow morning, as it had been polished every morning for more years than anyone who worked there could properly remember. Inside that window, arranged with careful attention to the passerby's view, sat several finished volumes in Morocco leather, their spines tooled in gold with intricate patterns that caught what remained of the daylight, and beside them a stack of marbled end papers in rich patterns of blue and crimson and ochre that seemed to shift and flow when looked at from different angles. The workshop itself stretched back from that front window into a space perhaps 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with a ceiling of dark beams from which hung 2 oil lamps, each fitted with a brass reflector that directed the light downward onto the work surfaces below. The walls were paneled in wood that had darkened over decades to a deep brown, and against these walls stood tall cabinets with many small drawers, each labeled in a careful hand with its contents. Bone folders, awls of various sizes, needles both curved and straight, spools of linen thread in different weights, pieces of beeswax for waxing thread, and countless other small implements that belonged to the binding trade. A third lamp stood on the main workbench itself, this one with a glass chimney that kept the flame steady and threw a pool of warm light across the scarred wooden surface where the evening's work continued in its patient, methodical way. The bookbinder who sat at this bench had been at his trade for 37 years, though he rarely thought of the matter in such terms, and his hands moved across the materials before him with a certainty that came not from thinking, but from having repeated these same motions so many thousands of times that they had become as natural as breathing. He was engaged now in the finishing work on a small devotional volume, 8 inches tall and perhaps 5 inches wide, bound in dark green Morocco leather that had already been pared thin as paper along its edges, turned over the boards, and adhered with wheat paste glue that had dried slowly over the past 2 days while the book rested under weights in the press that stood against the far wall. The covers themselves were ready, their surfaces smooth and even, waiting only for the final decoration that would transform them from simple protective cases into objects worthy of the sacred text they enclosed. Before him on the bench lay several brass finishing tools, each one fitted with a wooden handle turned from beech or boxwood, and at the tip of each handle extended a brass shaft no thicker than a pencil, ending in a small decorative element cut in relief. A simple line, a small fleuron, a corner piece in the Gothic style. These tools had been heating for the past several minutes on a small spirit lamp that stood at the edge of the workbench, its flame adjusted to a height that would bring the brass to the right temperature, hot enough to press a clear impression into the leather, but not so hot as to scorch or burn. The bookbinder lifted one of the tools from its resting place, holding the wooden handle lightly between his fingers, and tested the temperature of the brass tip by touching it quickly to a dampened sponge that sat in a shallow dish nearby. The moisture hissed softly, a sound barely louder than an exhaled breath, and the bookbinder nodded to himself and set the tool back to heat for another moment longer. The book itself rested on a small cushion of folded flannel cloth, positioned so that the front cover lay perfectly flat and level beneath the lamplight. The bookbinder had already traced the design he intended to create, marking it lightly in pencil directly onto the leather in lines so faint they would disappear entirely beneath the tooled impressions. The design was not elaborate, nothing like the ornate gilt patterns that decorated the expensive volumes produced for wealthy patrons, but rather a simple border following the edge of the cover, perhaps half an inch in from its outer limits, with a small centerpiece of intersecting lines forming a basic geometric pattern. This was work suitable to the book's purpose and to its eventual owner, a country vicar who had commissioned 6 such volumes and who required nothing more than tidiness and durability and a pleasant modesty of appearance that would not distract from devotional reading. The bookbinder took up the tool again, this time satisfied with its heat, and positioned the brass tip carefully against one corner of the pencil border, pressing down with steady, even pressure, holding the tool motionless for a count of 3 heartbeats before lifting it away. The impression left behind showed as a slight depression in the leather surface, a clean line, perhaps 1/8 of an inch in length, perfectly straight, catching the lamplight along its compressed edge. He set the tool aside to reheat and took up another, this one fitted with a curved element that would form the next portion of the border, and he repeated the process, positioning, pressing, counting, lifting, setting aside. The rhythm of this work was deeply familiar, almost meditative in its repetition, and the workshop settled into the particular silence that belongs to careful handwork, broken only by the tiny hiss of hot brass meeting dampened sponge and the soft sound of the tools being lifted and replaced on their heating stand. Outside, the evening continued its slow progression toward night, and the last of the daylight faded from the workshop window, leaving only the oil lamps to illuminate the space. The 2 hanging lamps cast a general glow across the room, their light reflecting softly from the glass doors of the cabinets and creating small pools of shadow in the corners where bolts of bookbinding cloth stood rolled and waiting, where stacks of boards rested in their measured sizes, where reams of paper lay wrapped in brown paper and labeled with the merchant's mark and the date of their purchase. The lamp on the workbench itself threw its brighter circle of light across the immediate area of work, illuminating the green Morocco cover, the brass tools with their turned wooden handles, the spirit lamp's steady flame, and the bookbinder's hands as they moved through their practiced motions with unhurried precision. The temperature in the workshop had not changed much since afternoon, held steady by the warmth of the lamps and by the general retained heat of the building's mass of brick and timber, and the air carried the faint smells that belonged to the trade. The particular scent of leather, which varied subtly depending on whether it was goat skin or calf skin or sheep skin, the slightly musty odor of old paper and bookboard, the clean smell of wheat paste glue, and underneath these the traces of linseed oil from the rags used to polish brass fittings and the waxy smell of the candles that were kept in a drawer for use when working late in the smaller back room where repairs were done on damaged volumes. These smells had long since become so familiar to the bookbinder that he no longer noticed them particularly, any more than one notices the smell of one's own home, but they contributed to the atmosphere of the space, creating an environment that felt contained and known and separate from the street outside. The border pattern progressed around the edge of the cover in small increments, each impression following the last with careful spacing maintained by eye and by the sense of proportion that came from years of similar work. The bookbinder did not hurry, because hurrying led to mistakes, to tools set down at slightly wrong angles or pressed with uneven force, to impressions that looked hasty or careless, and such flaws could not be undone once made. Instead, he worked with the same steady pace that he had maintained throughout the day, which had begun at 6:30 that morning and would end perhaps another hour from now, when this cover was finished and its mate completed to match. Tomorrow, the same cushion of flannel would support different work, perhaps the gathering and sewing of signatures for a ledger book, perhaps the rebacking of an old volume whose spine had deteriorated past the point of continued service. But for now, there was only this single task, this progression of small brass impressions forming a border on dark green leather. The spirit lamp required attention from time to time, its reservoir of alcohol needing to be checked to ensure the flame would not gutter out before the work was done, and the bookbinder paused occasionally to add a few drops from a small bottle kept near at hand, using a glass pipette to transfer the clear liquid without spillage. The flame responded to this feeding by rising slightly, then settling back to its previous steady height, and the brass tools continued to heat in their systematic rotation, one being used, 2 or 3 resting on the heating stand waiting their turn, one perhaps cooling slightly to one side if it had grown too hot and needed to come back to the proper temperature. This rotation was managed without conscious thought, the bookbinder's hands simply knowing which tool to reach for next, which required more heating and which was ready for immediate use. Across the workshop, the standing press remained where it had stood for more than 40 years, a substantial piece of equipment built from oak beams and fitted with a heavy iron screw mechanism that could exert tremendous pressure on the books placed between its boards. At present, the press held 3 volumes in various stages of completion, each one wrapped in protective paper and held firmly between pressing boards to ensure that the glued elements dried flat and true. The press would not be opened again until morning, when the books within would be removed and examined and, if ready, moved forward to whatever next stage their construction required. The screw of the press caught the lamplight along its spiral threads, and the oak uprights stood solid and dark, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of hands touching them in passing, leaning against them momentarily while reaching for something from a nearby shelf, or simply resting a hand there while standing in thought about some aspect of the work. The workbench itself bore the marks of its long service, its surface scarred with countless small cuts and dents and stains, each one a record of some past moment of work, some volume bound and sent out into the world years or decades ago. The wood had been plain smooth when the bench was new, but that smoothness had long since given way to the gentle undulations that came from uneven wear, with shallow depressions where work was most often done and slight elevations where the wood had been less frequently contacted. These variations in the surface were so slight that they would barely register to a hand passed across them. But the bookbinder knew them intimately, knew without looking where the bench dipped slightly near the center and where a particular knot in the wood created a harder spot resistant to the general wearing. He positioned his work instinctively to take advantage of the flat areas, avoiding the places where the surface might cause a book to sit at a slight angle. The border on the book cover progressed past the halfway point and began its journey down the second long edge, each impression placed with the same care as the ones before. The brass tools exchanged places in their rotation, heated, were used, cooled, reheated, in a cycle that had a rhythm almost like breathing. Inhale and exhale, take up and set down. The bookbinder's posture at the bench had not changed appreciably in the past hour. His back straight but not rigid, his shoulders relaxed, his arms positioned so that his hands could work without strain. This economy of movement came from the same deep practice that guided his hands, the body learning over years to find the positions that could be maintained comfortably through long sessions of detailed work. The clock on the wall, a simple timepiece with a round face and brass pendulum visible through a glass panel in its case, marked the progress of the evening with its quiet ticking, a sound so constant and regular that it became almost inaudible, noticed only when one specifically attended to it. The hands showed 8:30, which meant that 2 hours had passed since the lamps were lit, 2 hours of this same quiet work proceeding in its incremental fashion. The street outside had grown quieter still, the intervals between passing footsteps lengthening, and occasionally a voice would sound from somewhere in the building above, muffled by the intervening floors into an indistinct murmur that rose and fell and faded back into silence. The second side of the border completed, the bookbinder paused to examine his progress, tilting the book slightly under the lamplight to catch the impressions at an angle that made them more visible. The lines were even, the spacing consistent, each impression clean and clear without doubling or blurring. Satisfied, he set the book back on its flannel cushion and selected the tool he would need for the third side, testing its heat and finding it ready, beginning again the patient work of placement and impression, the quiet count to 3, the lifting away. The third side would be shorter than the first two, as it ran along the top edge of the book, and it would require attention to ensure that the corner pieces met the long sides precisely at the correct angles. In the cabinet against the wall, the drawers sat closed and silent, each one containing its ordered collection of tools and materials, brass compasses for measuring, marking awls with points filed to different degrees of sharpness, folding bones made from actual bone polished smooth as ivory, lengths of ribbon for use as bookmarks, small pots of size for preparing leather to receive gold leaf, packets of gold leaf itself stored flat between leaves of tissue paper, brushes of various sizes 4, applying paste and glue, and countless other items accumulated over the years as the trade required them. Some of these items saw daily use, others only occasionally when particular work demanded them, and some had not been removed from their drawers in months or even years but remained there nonetheless, maintained and ready should they ever again be needed. The bookbinder's hands continued their work, placing and pressing each brass tool in its turn, building the border line by line around the cover's edge. His breathing remained even and unlabored. His focus settled entirely on the small area illuminated by the lamp, the green Morocco leather, the brass tool in his hand, the correct positioning for the next impression. Beyond this narrow circle of attention, the workshop existed in a kind of soft peripheral awareness, its familiar shapes and shadows requiring no direct notice, the press standing dark and solid, the cabinets with their glass doors reflecting lamp glow, the rolls of cloth in the corner, the window giving onto the dark street, all of it present and known and requiring nothing. The third side of the border reached its completion, and the fourth and final side began, this one running along the bottom edge of the cover, parallel to the first side, but now approaching from the opposite direction, meeting the two short sides that connected them. The brass tools continued their rotation on the spirit lamp's heat, their wooden handles growing slightly warm to the touch, but never uncomfortably so, the turnwood having been selected partly for its poor conductivity of heat, keeping the bookbinder's fingers safe from the temperature required to properly impress the leather. Each tool, when lifted from the cover, left behind its mark and was returned to the heating stand to await its next use, while another tool was taken up, positioned, pressed, counted through 3 heartbeats, and lifted away in its turn. The rhythm of this work had a quality almost like the rhythm of walking, a steady pace that could be maintained for hours without exhaustion because it never demanded sudden effort or sustained intensity, only the constant repetition of movements that had become entirely natural. The bookbinder's breathing aligned itself unconsciously with this rhythm, inhaling as he positioned the tool, holding the breath steady as he pressed and counted, exhaling as he lifted the tool away and reached for the next. This alignment was not deliberate or even noticed, but it contributed to the sense of calm focus that characterized the work, the feeling that time had become less a series of distinct moments and more continuous flow carrying the work steadily forward. The oil lamps burned with their steady flames, drawing on the reservoir of oil in their bases through wicks that had been trimmed that morning and would be trimmed again tomorrow morning before the day's work began. The glass chimneys that protected the flames from drafts were slightly blackened at their tops, as lamp chimneys always became after some hours of burning, but this blackening did not noticeably reduce the light they cast, and in any case the chimneys would be removed tomorrow and washed clean with hot water and soap, then dried and replaced, this task being part of the routine maintenance that kept the workshop functioning properly. The brass reflectors above the hanging lamps showed the same careful maintenance, polished regularly so that their curved surfaces directed the maximum amount of light downward rather than letting it diffuse uselessly into the upper regions of the room. The final side of the border progressed toward its completion, each impression following the last in the established pattern, maintaining the same spacing and depth and clarity that characterized the work on the other 3 sides. The bookbinder's movements had not varied throughout the process, each placement of the brass tool showing the same care and precision as the first, without hurrying as the end approached, and without the relaxation of attention that can sometimes occur when a task nears completion. The border would be complete when it was complete, not before, and until that moment arrived, there was only the continuing work, the tool heated and tested and positioned and pressed and lifted and set aside, the next tool taken up, the process repeated. Somewhere in the building above, a door closed with a soft thump, and footsteps crossed a floor, paused, continued, and faded into silence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily onward, its pendulum swinging behind the glass panel, the brass weight at the pendulum's end catching occasional glints of lamplight as it passed through its arc. The street outside had fallen almost completely silent now, the hour grown late enough that even the taverns had begun to quiet, their patrons dispersing homeward, and the city settling into the relative stillness of night. Relative because London was never truly silent, never entirely still, but its nighttime sounds were different from its daytime sounds, softer and more intermittent, with long pauses between them. The border reached its final corner, where the last side met the first side that had been completed perhaps an hour earlier, and the bookbinder selected the corner tool, a small brass piece that would fill this angle with a decorative element matching the other three corners. He heated this tool with particular care, testing it twice on the dampened sponge before judging it ready, and then positioned it with equal care, ensuring that its placement would align precisely with the lines that approached from either side. The brass pressed into the leather, counting 1, 2, 3, and lifted away, leaving behind an impression that completed the border in a satisfactory joining. The bookbinder set the tool aside and examined the completed border, tilting the book under the lamplight, checking each corner and side for consistency, finding no flaws that required attention, no impressions that needed to be reworked. With the border complete, there remained only the central design, a simple pattern of intersecting lines forming a basic cross with small decorative elements at the intersections. The bookbinder consulted the penciled marks on the leather that indicated where these impressions should be placed, and he selected the appropriate tools from those heating on the spirit lamp stand, a straight line tool, and a small fleuron for the intersections. The central design would take less time than the border, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, and then the front cover would be finished and could be set aside while the same pattern was created on the back cover, which would occupy perhaps another hour and a half of the same quiet work. The straight line tool pressed its impression from top to bottom of the cover, centered with care to bisect the space evenly, and then a second impression ran from left to right, crossing the first at right angles in the cover center. At this intersection, the bookbinder placed a small fleuron, a decorative element of 4 petals arranged in a cross pattern, and at each point where the lines reached the border, he placed similar fleurons, creating a simple but pleasing pattern that gave the cover interest without overwhelming it with decoration. The work proceeded with the same steadiness that had characterized the border, each impression placed with care, each tool heated to the proper temperature and pressed with even force, each element of the pattern contributing to the whole. The front cover completed, the bookbinder set it carefully aside on a clean area of the workbench and took up the back cover, positioning it on the flannel cushion in the same way the front cover had been positioned. The pencil guidelines were already traced, mirror, ing the pattern on the front, and the brass tools had remained hot during the brief interval of transition, requiring no additional heating to bring them back to working temperature. The border began again at the same corner where the front cover's border had begun, the first impression placed, the second, the third, building the pattern line by line around the edge of the dark green leather. The workshop continued in its settled quietness, the lamps burning steady, the tools heating and cooling in their rotation, the bookbinder's hands moving through their practiced motions. The standing press remained dark and solid against its wall. The cabinet drawers held their contents in ordered arrangement. The rolls of bookbinding cloth stood in their corner, and the window looked out onto a street where no one now passed. Time moved forward in its inevitable way, measured by the clock's quiet ticking and by the slow progression of the border around the cover's edge. But within the circle of lamplight that illuminated the work, time seemed to have less meaning, becoming instead simply the medium through which the hands moved and the brass tools pressed their impressions into leather that would outlast the maker by decades or perhaps by centuries. The bookbinder did not think about this larger span of time, any more than he thought about the individual motions of his hands or the counting of heartbeats that timed each impression. The work itself occupied his attention fully without demanding conscious analysis. His mind as quiet as his hands were active, resting in the simple focus that came from engaging in a task that required skill but not constant decision-making. Each step following naturally from the last in a sequence that had been repeated so many times that it existed now almost as a single continuous action rather than as a series of discrete movements. The border on the back cover progressed past its first corner and down the first long side, each impression matching in position and clarity those on the front cover, maintaining the consistency that would make the two covers appear as a harmonious pair rather than as separate objects. The brass tools continued their rotation, heating and cooling, being used and set aside and taken up again, their wooden handles smooth and familiar in the bookbinder's grip, their brass tips pressing into the leather with a slight resistance that characterized well-paired morocco, neither too soft to hold a crisp impression nor too hard to accept the tool's mark without excessive pressure. Outside, a church bell struck 9, its tone carrying through the night air and through the window glass into the workshop, where it registered as a distant, almost abstract sound, noted but not dwelt upon, simply another element in the evening's progression. The bookbinder did not pause in his work when the bell struck, his hands continuing their movement without interruption, placing the next impression and the next, the border growing around the cover's edge in its patient incremental fashion. The second long side of the border began, the tools exchanging places in their established rotation, the brass tips pressing and lifting, each impression contributing its small part to the pattern. The lamplight remained steady and warm, throwing its glow across the work surface and leaving the corners of the workshop in relative shadow, creating a sense of enclosure and containment that made the space feel smaller than it was, compressed down to the immediate area of work and the hands that performed it and the tools that served it. Beyond this compressed space, the rest of the workshop existed in a kind of patient waiting, the press and the cabinets and the rolls of cloth and all the other equipment and materials standing ready for when they would be needed, but for now requiring nothing, drawing no attention, simply being present in their familiar places. The border continued its progression, the second long side completing and the first short side beginning, running along the top edge of the cover between the two long sides. The bookbinder's posture had not changed, his back still straight, his shoulders still relaxed, his breathing still even and calm. The work did not tire him because he did not fight against it, did not try to force it to proceed faster than its natural pace, did not tense his muscles or hold his breath or narrow his focus to the point of strain. Instead, he worked with a kind of relaxed attention that could be maintained indefinitely, the hands doing what they knew how to do, while the mind rested in the simple observation of the work's progress. The tools pressed and lifted, heated and cooled, were used and set aside and taken up again in their continuous cycle. The spirit lamp burned with its steady flame, fed occasionally with a few drops of alcohol from the glass pipette, its heat supporting the work without demanding constant attention. The clock ticked onward, its hands moving across the face in their measured sweep, recording the passage of time that within the workshop seemed less like passage and more like a kind of extended present moment. The past and future collapsed into the now of the work being done, the impression being placed, the tool being lifted, the next tool being selected. The first short side completed and the second long side began, this one running along the bottom edge of the cover, parallel to the first long side that had been completed perhaps half an hour earlier. The pattern of impressions continued with the same regular spacing and consistent depth, each one a small depression in the leather surface, a record of the brass tool's pressure and the heat that had prepared the leather to receive it. These impressions would remain visible for as long as the leather itself survived, potentially for centuries if the book was well cared for, stored properly away from excessive light and moisture, handled with clean hands, and not subjected to the various misfortunes that could befall a volume over a long life. The bookbinder did not think about this potential longevity, any more than he thought about the various books he had bound over the past 37 years, where they might be now, who might be reading them or shelving them, or perhaps forgetting them on some dusty shelf in a country parsonage or a lawyer's office or a private library. Each book he bound received the same care and attention regardless of its eventual destination. The work itself being reward enough, the satisfaction of creating something well-made and fit for its purpose, something that would serve its owner's needs and stand up to the use it would receive. The border progressed toward its completion, the second long side giving way to the final short side, which would meet the first long side at the corner where the pattern had begun. The brass tools continued their rotation, the bookbinder's hands continued their practiced movements, and the workshop held its quiet atmosphere of focused activity enclosed within the larger stillness of the night. The oil lamps burned steadily in their places, the press stood solid and patient against its wall, and the window gave onto a street where no light showed in any of the buildings opposite, their inhabitants having retired hours ago to their beds, leaving the neighborhood to whatever watchmen walked their rounds, and to the cats that hunted in the alleyways, and to the general sleeping presence of the city at rest. The final short side approached its completion, each impression following the last in the established pattern, maintaining the same quality and spacing that had characterized the entire border. The bookbinder's breathing remained even, his posture unchanged, his focus settled on the work without tension or forcing. The brass tool pressed into the leather, counting 1, 2, 3, and lifted away, leaving its mark, and was set aside while the next tool was taken up and positioned and pressed in its turn. The rhythm of this work was as steady as the clock's ticking, as regular as the breathing of a person deeply asleep, moving forward without variation because variation was not required, only the continuation of what had already been established. The final corner approached, where the border would close upon itself, and the bookbinder selected the corner tool that would complete this angle, heating it with the same care he had given to the first corner of the front cover hours earlier, testing it on the dampened sponge, judging its temperature, finding it ready. The tool positioned, pressed, counted through 3 heartbeats, lifted away, the impression complete, the border finished. The bookbinder set the tool aside and examined the completed border, tilting the cover under the lamplight to catch the impressions at the angle where they showed most clearly, checking each corner and side for consistency with the front cover, finding the pattern satisfactory, finding no flaws that required attention. There remained now only the central design, the same simple pattern of intersecting lines and small fleurons that decorated the front cover, and the bookbinder selected the appropriate tools and began this final portion of the evening's work, the straight line tool pressing its impression from top to bottom. Then from left to right, the small fleurons placed at the intersections and at the points where the lines met the border. The work proceeded with the same steadiness that had characterized everything that had gone before, each impression placed with care, each tool heated properly and pressed with even force, the pattern building towards completion. The central design finished. The bookbinder set the completed back cover carefully beside its mate on the clean area of workbench, the 2 covers now matching pairs, their borders and central patterns identical in placement and execution, if not in the microscopic variations that necessarily accompanied handwork. These 2 covers would be held under gentle weight overnight to ensure the impressed patterns did not relax, and tomorrow they would be examined in daylight to confirm their quality before the book was completed with the final assembly of covers to text block, the insertion of the end papers, and the application of the spine covering that would unite the elements into a finished volume ready for delivery to its owner. But that work belonged to tomorrow, and for now there was only the completion of today's labor, the putting away of tools and the damping of the spirit lamp, and the turning down of the oil lamp's wicks to conserve their fuel until morning. The bookbinder began this process of conclusion, setting the brass finishing tools aside to cool completely before they would be returned to their drawer, adding a few drops of oil to the spirit lamp to replace what had been consumed during the evening's work, wiping the workbench surface with a soft cloth to remove any traces of glue or moisture. His movements during this tidying had the same unhurried quality as his working movements, nothing rushed or careless, each small task completed properly before moving to the next. The oil lamp's wicks turned down, their flames diminished to small points of light that would burn through the night at this reduced intensity, keeping the workshop from complete darkness and preventing the oil from congealing in the reservoir during the cool hours before dawn. The spirit lamp extinguished, its small flame guttering out as the fuel line was closed, the metal body of the lamp cooling gradually toward room temperature. The brass tools left on the workbench to complete their cooling, their wooden handles no longer warm to the touch, the brass tips releasing the heat they had held during the working hours. The completed covers placed carefully between pressing boards, and those boards laid flat on a shelf where they would rest undisturbed until morning. The flannel cushion folded and set aside. The dampened sponge squeezed dry and left to air. The glass pipette rinsed with water and returned to its place beside the alcohol bottle. The workshop settled into its nighttime state, the lamps burning low, the tools at rest, the work completed for the day and waiting to be resumed tomorrow. The bookbinder moved toward the door that led to the narrow stairs climbing to the upper floor where his small set of rooms waited. But he paused before leaving, as he paused every evening, to look back across the workshop in the diminished light, checking that everything was properly secured, that no lamp stood where it might be knocked over, that no tools had been left in positions where they might fall or be damaged, that the workshop was ready to be left to itself through the night hours. Until morning came and work began again. Everything stood as it should, the press solid and patient, the cabinets closed, the workbench cleared except for the cooling tools, the window latched, the floor swept clean of the day's accumulated scraps and dust. The bookbinder nodded to himself in the dim light and turned toward the door, his footsteps quiet on the floorboards, crossing from the back of the workshop toward the front where the stairs rose through the building's interior. Behind him the workshop held its stillness, the low lamps casting their gentle glow across familiar surfaces, the tools and materials resting in their places, waiting through the night hours for tomorrow's work to begin. And in this waiting, there was a quality of perfect patience, a sense that the workshop existed in a time outside of ordinary time, where the rhythms of work and rest had repeated for decades and would continue to repeat for decades more, each day bringing its own particular tasks, but all the days sharing the same essential character of careful handwork performed in this contained space, within these walls, beneath these lamps, using these tools and materials that had served so long and so well. The bookbinder reached the door and passed through it into the narrow hallway beyond, where darkness waited to be broken by the candle he would light from the banked coals of the small fireplace in his sitting room. And the stairs rose before him toward the upper rooms where a simple meal waited, and then bed and sleep, and tomorrow's early rising to begin again, the work that filled his days with purpose and steady rhythm, and the quiet satisfaction of craft practiced well. But for now, in these moments between the end of work and the arrival at rest, there was only the climbing of the stairs in the darkness, one hand on the rail worn smooth by decades of previous hands, feet finding the steps without thought, breathing easy and unhurried. The day's work completed and tomorrow's work waiting, but neither one demanding attention in this transitional space between them. The stairs rose through the darkness, and the bookbinder climbed them, and behind him the workshop below the lamps burned low and steady, their small flames patient and constant, keeping watch through the night hours, and the tools rested in their places, and the press stood solid, and the cabinets held their ordered contents, and the completed covers waited between their boards for tomorrow's light. And the window looked out onto the dark street where no one passed, and time moved forward in its inevitable way, but gently, softly, without urgency or disturbance, carrying the night toward morning as it had carried evening into night, the same slow progression that had repeated since the building was raised and would repeat until time itself found its conclusion. And in this repetition, there was a deep restfulness, a sense that all things proceeded as they should, in their proper order, according to rhythms older than any single life and more enduring than any particular days. Concerns. If you have found some rest in this quiet evening at the bookbinder's workshop, perhaps you might allow yourself to drift now into sleep with the same gentle ease that characterized the work we observe there. And if you have enjoyed this time of calm reflection, you might consider returning to this channel for other such moments of peace, though there is no obligation and no urgency. Only an invitation offered softly and without expectation, and if it pleases you to leave some word in the comments below, even a simple greeting or a single quiet thought, that would be welcome, Though silence too is welcome, because in the end what matters most is simply the rest you have found and the sleep that waits to receive you, carrying you through the night hours toward tomorrow's light, gentle and patient and as natural as breathing. The bookbinder reached the upper landing where a narrow passage led to his rooms, 3 small chambers arranged along the back of the building, their windows overlooking a cramped yard shared with the neighboring properties, where in daylight could be seen the jumbled collection of outbuildings and walls and washing lines that characterize such London spaces, but which now showed only as darker shapes against the general darkness of the night. The passage was familiar enough that no light was needed to navigate it, his feet knowing the slight rise where one floorboard sat higher than its neighbors, the place where the wall jogged inward by a few inches to accommodate some structural beam, the exact distance from the top of the stairs to the door of a sitting room, which stood third along the passage and opened when its latch was lifted with the particular motion required to prevent the mechanism from sticking. The sitting room was small, perhaps 10 feet square, with a narrow window on one wall and a fireplace on another, the remaining walls occupied by a bookshelf holding perhaps 24 volumes, a narrow cupboard where dishes and utensils were kept, and a small table with 2 chairs positioned beneath the window where in daylight one might sit to read or to take a meal. The fireplace held the remnants of fire that had been banked before the bookbinder descended to the workshop that morning, the coals buried beneath a covering of ash to preserve them through the day. And now he knelt before the hearth and used a small brass poker to disturb this ash, revealing the red glow of embers that had survived the long hours of neglect, waiting to be called back into flame. From the cupboard he took a few pieces of kindling, thin strips of wood saved from packing crates and broken boxes, and these he arranged carefully over the exposed embers, leaning them together to create a small structure that would allow air to flow while concentrating the heat. The embers responded to this new fuel and to the increased airflow, brightening slightly, and wisps of smoke began to rise from the kindling where it contacted the heat. The bookbinder watched this process with the same patient attention he brought to his work, not hurrying or forcing, simply allowing the fire to build in its own time. And after a few moments the kindling caught, small flames appearing and spreading along the dry wood, growing larger as they consumed their fuel. He added slightly larger pieces of wood, maintaining the structure that allowed air to flow, and the fire grew steadily, throwing its light across the small room and beginning to warm the air, which had cooled during the day to match the general temperature of the building. The bookbinder remained kneeling before the fire for a few moments longer, ensuring that it had established itself sufficiently to continue burning without his attention, and then he rose and turned to the other tasks that marked the transition from work to rest. A candle in a simple brass holder sat on the mantelpiece, and he lit this from the fire, using a long splinter of wood to carry the flame from hearth to wick, and the candle added its smaller light to the fire's glow, making the room bright enough for whatever activities the evening might hold. Those activities were few and simple, as they were every evening, following a pattern that varied little from one day to the next. On the table beneath the window sat a covered dish that had been left there by his landlady that morning, containing the evening meal she prepared for him each day as part of their arrangement. Tonight a portion of cold meat pie and some bread and a small wedge of cheese, accompanied by a bottle of small beer that had been drawn that morning from the cask the landlady kept in her own quarters 1 floor below. This meal the bookbinder ate standing by the fire, warming himself while he consumed the simple food, chewing slowly and thoroughly, not tasting it with particular attention, but not ignoring it either. Simply eating as one does when hunger has been earned through the day's labor and food provides the necessary restoration. The meal finished, he rinsed the plate and cup at the small basin in the corner of the room, using water from a pitcher that was filled each morning from the pump in the yard below. And he set these items aside to dry, turning them upside down on a cloth spread for that purpose. The fire had grown to a comfortable size now, not too large to be wasteful of fuel, but sufficient to warm the room and provide pleasant light, and the bookbinder took one of the 2 chairs from the table and positioned it before the hearth, settling himself into it with a slight sigh that marked the final release of the day's activity, the true arrival at rest. From the bookshelf he had earlier taken a volume, one he had been reading slowly over the past several weeks, moving through it at a pace of perhaps 10 or 15 pages each evening, not hurrying to reach its conclusion, but allowing the text to unfold in its own time. And this book now lay on the arm of the chair where he had left it the previous evening. It was a work of natural history, describing the flora and fauna of the English countryside with careful observation and occasional philosophical reflection, written in a clear, unhurried style that suited the bookbinder's temperament and his evening state of mind. He took up the book now and opened it to the place he had marked with a thin ribbon, finding his position in the text and beginning to read in the combined light of fire and candle. The words moved past his attention at the pace his eyes traveled across the page, describing the habits of various birds that nested in hedgerows, the particular plants that attracted them, the times of year when their songs could be heard most frequently. The bookbinder read without urgency, sometimes pausing to consider a passage more carefully, sometimes allowing his eyes to move forward while his mind rested in a kind of gentle partial attention that took in the general sense without fixing on every detail. The fire crackled softly as pockets of moisture or resin in the wood encountered the heat, and outside the window the darkness held its complete coverage of the yard and the surrounding buildings, no lights visible in any direction. The neighborhood given over entirely to sleep. The chair where he sat was old and simple, made from turned wood with a woven rush seat that had compressed over years of use into a shape that accommodated his form comfortably, supporting him without particular softness, but without hardness either, simply holding him in a position that could be maintained through the hour or so he typically spent reading before retiring to bed. The fire warmed the side of him that faced it while his other side remained cooler, and from time to time he shifted slightly to even this distribution of heat, moving without conscious decision, the body adjusting itself as bodies do when given time and permission to find their comfort. The pages of the book turn one by one, the text progressing through its description of hedgerow birds to a discussion of the hedgerows themselves, the various plants that compose them, the way these living fences have been established over centuries to mark boundaries between fields and provide shelter for livestock and support wildlife and prevent erosion of the soil on sloping land. The author wrote with evident affection for his subject, describing the hawthorn and blackthorn and holly that formed the structural elements of these hedges, the brambles and wild roses that filled their gaps, the herbs and grasses that grew at their bases, creating complex ecosystems that supported far more life than the fields they bounded. The bookbinder read this description with mild interest, neither deeply engaged nor bored, simply allowing the information to pass through his awareness in the same way he allowed the fire's warmth to pass into his body, receiving what was offered without grasping at it or pushing it away. His breathing had slowed somewhat since he sat down, becoming deeper and more regular, and his body had settled more completely into the chair's support, releasing tensions he had not known he carried until they were gone. The day's work belonged to the past now, completed and set aside, and tomorrow's work had not yet arrived, leaving only this present moment of sitting before the fire with a book in his hands, the words moving past his eyes, the warmth touching his face and hands, the darkness pressing against the window glass. From somewhere in the building came the faint sound of a door closing, so distant and muffled that it registered barely above the threshold of hearing, and then silence returned, broken only by the fire's occasional crackle and the turn of a page and the bookbinder's own breathing. The candle on the mantelpiece burned steadily, its flame drawn upright by the draft from the chimney, casting small moving shadows on the wall as air currents too slight to be felt nonetheless disturbed the flame's perfect stillness. The brass candle holder reflected this flame in miniature on its polished surface, a tiny point of light that trembled and steadied, in rhythm with variations too small to trace to any source. The book progressed through several more pages, moving from the description of hedgerows to a consideration of the small mammals that made their homes within them, the field mice and shrews and voles that burrowed among the roots and emerged at twilight to forage in the grasses, and the predators that hunted them, the owls that quartered the fields on silent wings, and the foxes that prowled the hedge bases with patient alertness. The author described these relationships without sentiment, but also without coldness, presenting them as natural patterns that had existed long before human observation and would continue long after, cycles of hunger and satiation, hunting and escaping, death and renewal that turn through the seasons in their endless repetition. The bookbinder's eyes moved across these descriptions, taking in the information without forming strong responses to it, neither disturbed by the violence it described, nor particularly moved by its beauty, simply acknowledging it as an account of how things were in the world beyond the city's boundaries. In the fields and hedgerows he had seen during occasional journeys to visit relations in the country, but which occupied no significant portion of his daily thoughts. His world was the workshop and these small rooms and the streets between them and the vendors from whom he purchased his meals and the occasional church service on Sunday mornings, a circumscribed territory that held everything he needed and left little reason to venture beyond its familiar limits. The fire had begun to settle somewhat, its initial enthusiasm diminishing as the first rush of wood was consumed, and the bookbinder set his book aside for a moment to add another piece of fuel, selecting it from a small store kept in a box beside the hearth, placing it carefully on the bed of coals that glowed beneath the flames. The new wood began to smoke almost immediately, white wisps rising and then catching in a flame as the heat drew out the volatile elements, and the fire brightened again, its light strengthening across the room. The bookbinder returned to his chair and took up the book once more, finding his place and continuing through the text. The chapter on hedgerows concluded and a new chapter began, this one treating the subject of woodland birds, those species that made their homes in the larger trees rather than in the dense growth of hedges, and the author opened this discussion with observations on the different character of woodland compared to hedgerow, the greater height of the canopy, the deeper shade, the different plants that grew in this reduced light. The presence of deadwood, both standing and fallen, that provided habitat for insects and fungi and the birds that fed upon them. The bookbinder read this opening with the same mild attention he had given to the previous chapter, the words registering without creating any particular desire to see these woodlands for himself or any strong curiosity about the details being described. His eyelids had grown somewhat heavier as he read, not from boredom, but from the natural accumulation of the day's fatigue, the long hours at the workbench adding themselves to the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the chair and the lateness of the hour to create a gentle pressure towards sleep. He did not resist this pressure, but neither did he immediately surrender to it, continuing to read for a while longer, allowing the transition from wakefulness to sleep to occur gradually rather than abruptly, moving through the text until he reached the end of a section that seemed a natural stopping place. That place arrived after another few pages, at the conclusion of the author's description of a particular species of woodpecker and its habit of storing acorns in holes it drilled in dead trees, creating what the author termed a natural larder that could sustain the bird through winter months when other food was scarce. The bookbinder marked this place with his ribbon and closed the book, setting it aside on the small table that stood beside his chair, and he remained sitting for a few moments longer, watching the fire burn and feeling the warmth on his face and hands, not thinking about anything in particular, simply resting in the quiet of the room and the comfortable fatigue of his body. The fire would be allowed to burn down through the night, its coals banked again before he retired to the bedroom that lay beyond the sitting room's far wall, a space even smaller than this one, holding only a narrow bed and a washstand and a chest for his limited wardrobe. But before moving to that final stage of the evening's progression, the bookbinder sat a while longer in his chair, his hands resting on its arms, his breathing slow and deep, his gaze fixed on the flames without focusing sharply on them, seeing them in the slightly blurred way one sees things when looking at them without truly directing attention toward them. The vision registering light and movement and color, but not analyzing these into distinct elements or meanings. The clock in the workshop below, its ticking too faint to be heard through the intervening floor, continued its measurement of time's passage, and in houses throughout the neighborhood similar clocks marked the same progression, some running slightly fast and some slightly slow, but all advancing through the night hours toward morning with mechanical certainty. In those houses, in rooms not unlike this one, other people sat before other fires or lay already in their beds, moving through their own evening rituals or surrendered already to sleep, and beyond them the city extended in all directions, vast and populous and never entirely still. Its nighttime sounds different from its daytime sounds, but continuous nonetheless. A low background presence of distant wheels and occasional voices and dogs barking and watchmen calling the hours and all the other. Noises that marked human habitation continuing its patterns through darkness as through light. But in this small room, in this chair before this particular fire, there was only the bookbinder and the settling flames and the candle burning on the mantelpiece and the darkness beyond the window glass. And the quiet that enclosed these elements felt complete and sufficient, requiring nothing from beyond itself, holding within its boundaries everything necessary for rest and restoration. The bookbinder rose finally from his chair, his movements slow and slightly stiff from sitting, and he crossed to the fireplace to bank the coals as he had done that morning, using the poker to spread them evenly across the hearth floor, and then covering them with ash to preserve them through the night hours, reducing the flames to darkness, and leaving only a faint red glow visible through the ash's gray covering. The candle he carried with him as he moved toward the bedroom, its small flame providing sufficient light to navigate the familiar space, and he passed through the narrow doorway into the smaller room beyond, where the bed waited with its covers already turned down from the morning's making, ready to receive him. The bedroom held no fire, and its air was noticeably cooler than the sitting rooms, carrying the chill that accumulated in such spaces during winter evenings, but the bed itself would provide warmth once he was settled beneath its blankets, and the cold was not severe enough to cause discomfort, only a sharpness in the air that would make the bed's warmth more welcome by contrast. He set the candle on the washstand and began the simple preparations for sleep, removing his work clothes and folding them with the same care he brought to his bookbinding, placing them on the chest where they would wait for morning, and pulling on the long nightshirt that hung from a peg on the wall. His movements were methodical and unhurried, each action completed before the next began, the undressing and the washing of hands and face and the brief attention to teeth and the final extinguishing of the candle, which left the room in complete darkness, broken only by the faint suggestion of the window's shape, where some trace of ambient light from the city's general glow penetrated the glass. The bed creaked slightly as he climbed into it, the rope supports that held the mattress stretching under his weight and then settling into their accustomed shape, and the blankets were heavy and slightly rough against the skin, that had been woven many years ago and washed many times since, becoming softer with each washing, but never losing entirely its fundamental woolen texture. The pillow beneath his head was filled with feathers that had compressed over time into a shape that matched his head's form, supporting it without particular softness, but adequately, familiarly, the way it had supported his head through thousands of nights of sleep. He lay on his side, facing the window, though in the darkness there was nothing to see through it, only the sense of its presence as a slightly less dark rectangle against the wall's deeper darkness. His breathing deepened further as his body recognized this position and this moment as the beginning of sleep, and the day's events began to fade from his conscious awareness. The images of brass tools and green Morocco leather and lamplight on workbench surfaces drifting away like boats released from their moorings, floating downstream into some region beyond active thought. The workshop below stood in its own darkness now, the low-burning lamps providing only minimal illumination, the tools resting in their places, the press standing patient and solid, the completed book covers waiting between their boards for tomorrow's light. Tomorrow would bring the same pattern as today, the early rising and the descent to the workshop and the lighting of lamps and the beginning of work that would continue through the morning and afternoon and into evening, the same rhythm that had repeated for decades and would continue to repeat, each day bringing its own particular tasks, but all the days sharing the essential character of careful handwork performed in that contained space with those familiar tools and materials. But tomorrow belonged to tomorrow and required no attention now, and today had completed itself and released its hold on attention, leaving only this moment of lying in bed in darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, feeling the weight of blankets and the support of mattress and the gradual softening of consciousness as sleep approached. The boundary between waking and sleep was not sharply defined, but rather a gradual transition, a slow fading of awareness that occurred without being noticed, the mind releasing its grip on thought and sensation and drifting into the different mode of being that characterized sleep, where time passed without being measured and consciousness operated according to its own logic rather than the logic of waking life. The bookbinder moved through this transition as he had moved through the evening's other transitions, without resistance or grasping, simply allowing each state to give way to the next in its natural progression. And sleep, when it arrived, came not as an interruption, but as a continuation, the final movement in the day's long sequence, completing the pattern and beginning the rest that would restore him for tomorrow's work. In the workshop below, the lamps burned their slow consumption of oil, their flames patient and steady through the night hours, and the tools rested, and the press stood, and the window looked onto the empty street, and time moved forward in its gentle, inevitable way, carrying the night toward morning, the darkness toward light, the rest toward waking, in the same ancient rhythm that had sustained craftsmen in their workshops and sleepers in their beds since such things had existed and would continue to sustain them for as long as such things would continue to exist. And in that rhythm there was a deep peace, a sense that all was as it should be, proceeding in its proper order, and nothing was required except to rest within it and allow it to carry everything forward in its own perfect time. The bookbinder's breathing settled into the deep, regular pattern of sleep, his body entirely relaxed now into the bed support, the tensions of waking consciousness released completely, and the room held him in its darkness with the same patient constancy that the workshop held its tools and materials, everything in its place, nothing demanding attention or action, simply existing in the stillness of the night hours. The blankets that covered him had warmed with his body's heat, creating a small envelope of comfort against the cooler air of the room, and within this envelope he rested without movement, his sleep undisturbed by dreams or restlessness, the deep sleep of a person who had expended the day's energy in useful work and whose body had no reason to resist the restoration that sleep provided. Beyond the window, the night continued its slow progression, the darkness holding steady over the city and the surrounding countryside, over the fields and hedgerows described in the book the bookbinder had been reading, over the woodlands where the birds nested that the author had catalogued with such care, over rivers and roads and villages, and all the various features of the land that existed whether observed or not, whether thought about or forgotten, simply being what they were in the darkness as in the light. The stars moved across the sky in their ancient patterns, though clouds obscured them from view over London this night, and the moon, if it was visible at all, showed only as a diffuse glow behind those clouds, providing no particular illumination, but present nonetheless in its appointed phase and position. In the workshop below, the oil lamps continued their burning, their flames having diminished slightly as the wicks consumed the available fuel and drew down the level in the reservoirs, but still providing enough light to show the general shapes of the room's contents, the press and the cabinets, and the workbench with its cooling brass tools still lying where they had been left to complete their release of heat. The window glass reflected these small flames in distorted miniature, and beyond that glass the street remained empty and silent, no movement visible in any direction. The neighborhood settled into its deepest stillness in these hours past midnight, when even those who kept late hours had mostly retired, and those who would rise early had not yet begun to stir. The building itself, the structure of brick and timber that housed the workshop and the bookbinder's rooms and the apartments of the clerk's family on the upper floor, stood solid and dark among its neighboring buildings, all of them similarly dark and silent. The entire row of structures presenting a continuous wall to the street, their windows showing no lights, their doors closed and latched, their occupants asleep or at least at rest within their private spaces. The bricks of which these buildings were constructed had been fired perhaps 60 or 70 years earlier, formed from clay dug from pits that no longer existed, having been filled in and built over as the city expanded, and those bricks had been laid by masons whose names were long forgotten, whose own sleep had ended decades ago in deaths that left no particular record. But the work of their hands persisted in these walls that stood firm and level and continued to serve their purpose of shelter and separation and support. The timber framing within those brick walls, the beams and joists and rafters that carried the loads and divided the spaces and created the structure's internal organization. This timber had been trees once, growing in forests that had been cleared to make way for fields or buildings or roads, cut down and sawn and shaped and fitted into place by carpenters who brought to their work the same kind of practice skill that the bookbinder brought to his, the same attention to proper technique and appropriate materials and careful execution. And those carpenters, too, were gone now, their names forgotten if they had ever been widely known, but their work remained, the joints still tight, the beams still strong, the whole assembly still performing its function of holding the building together and keeping its floors level and its walls upright. In the bedroom where the bookbinder slept, the darkness was absolute, no source of light penetrating from any direction, and in that darkness time seemed to lose its usual character of progression and become instead a kind of eternal present, each moment identical to the last and to the next, without distinction or variation, simply the ongoing fact of darkness and stillness, and the sleeping man breathing in his bed. His sleep deepened through these hours, moving through the cycles that characterize human rest, periods of lighter sleep alternating with periods of deeper unconsciousness, his brain performing whatever mysterious processes it performed during these different states, sorting and organizing the day's experiences, maintaining the body's various systems, preparing for the eventual return to waking consciousness that would come with morning's light. But morning remained distant still, several hours away, and the night had time yet to run its full course, the darkness time yet to maintain its hold over the city and the surrounding land. In other rooms throughout the building and throughout the neighborhood, other sleepers lay in their own beds, each one enclosed in their own private darkness, breathing their own rhythms, dreaming their own dreams, or resting in dreamless unconsciousness. The entire population of the area surrendered to sleep's necessary restoration, giving themselves over to that daily rehearsal of death that returns them to life each morning. That small death and resurrection that human beings have experienced every day of their lives since birth and will continue to experience until that final sleep from which there is no waking. The bookbinder knew nothing of these philosophical considerations as he slept, his consciousness having withdrawn entirely from such abstractions into whatever nonverbal, non-rational state characterized deep sleep, and if dreams visited him, they left no impression strong enough to disturb his rest or to be remembered upon waking. passing through his sleeping mind like wine through empty branches, present for a moment and then gone without trace. His body, meanwhile, performed its own work of restoration, repairing the small damages that accumulated through any day of physical activity, replenishing the energy stores that had been depleted during the hours of waking, adjusting the various chemical balances that required sleep's particular conditions to be properly maintained, all of this happening without conscious direction or awareness. The body's wisdom operating below the level of thought or intention. The hours passed in their measured way, marked only by the clock in the workshop below, whose mechanism continued its precise regulation of time's flow, even though no one remained awake to observe it. The gears turning, and the escapement ticking, and the hands sweeping across the face in their circular path. And in this continuation of measurement through the empty hours, there was something both purposeful and purposeless. The clock performing its function regardless of whether that function served any immediate need, simply doing what clocks do, because that is what they are made to do, marking time whether anyone attends to that marking or not. In the grate of the sitting room's fireplace, the banked coals continued their slow combustion beneath their covering of ash, the wood breaking down into carbon and releasing heat at a rate so slow as to be barely perceptible, the red glow visible through the ash gradually dimming as the available fuel was consumed, but the process would continue through most of the night hours, leaving enough live coals in the morning to serve as the seed for the new day's fire, the cycle continuing unbroken. From one day to the next, fire begetting fire in an unbroken chain stretching back to the day the fireplace was first used and extending forward to whenever it might be used for the final time. The workshop's lamps burned their own slow consumption, their flames drawing steadily on the oil in their reservoirs, converting that stored chemical energy into light and heat that spread through the space in gradually diminishing amounts as the night progressed. And eventually these lamps, too, would exhaust their available fuel and gutter out, leaving the workshop in complete darkness until morning came and new oil was added and the wicks were trimmed and the flames were relit to begin another day's illumination. But that moment of darkness had not yet arrived. The oil still sufficient for several hours more of burning, and the lamps continued their patient watch over the silent workshop, their light falling on surfaces that had been shaped and placed and arranged by human hands, but which now existed without human presence, the tools and benches and cabinets simply being what they were in the lamplight, fulfilling no immediate purpose, but ready to serve whatever purpose might be required when morning brought the return of human activity. The press stood in its place against the wall, its heavy oak beams bearing the weight of the iron screw mechanism without strain or effort, the whole assembly as solid and stable as the day it had been constructed 4 decades earlier, and within its jaws the 3 volumes rested under their steady pressure, the glue in their bindings drying slowly and evenly, the materials being compressed into the configurations that would become permanent once the drying was complete, transforming separate elements into unified objects, gatherings of paper and covers of board and leather becoming books, objects that could be handled and read and shelved and passed from hand to hand over years or decades, or potentially centuries of use. Those books knew nothing of their own transformation, being inanimate objects incapable of knowing anything. But if they could know, they might sense the pressure that held them and the slow chemical changes occurring in their glues and the gradual settling of their materials into final positions, and they might rest in that process as the bookbinder rested in his sleep. Both the books and the sleeper undergoing transformations that would restore or complete them, making them ready for whatever uses the morning would bring, whatever work or reading or handling would be required of them once the night's restoration had finished its course. The darkness outside the windows remained complete, no lightning yet in the eastern sky to suggest the approach of dawn, the night holding its deepest stillness in these hours before morning, when even the latest of late workers had ceased their labors and the earliest of early risers had not yet begun to wake, when the city existed in as close to silence as it ever achieved, the background sounds reduced to their minimum. Only the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a wagon on some far street, or the call of a night watchman marking the hours for any who remain awake to hear. But in the bookbinder's workshop and in his rooms above, no such sounds penetrated, or if they did, they registered so faintly as to make no impression on the silence that enclosed those spaces, leaving them in a quietness so complete it seemed almost to have substance, to be not merely the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, a quality of the night that filled the rooms as darkness filled them. Both silence and darkness being conditions rather than things, states of being rather than objects, but both feeling none the less like presences that occupied the spaces and gave them their particular character during these hours of deep night. The bookbinder's breathing continued its slow, regular rhythm, the sound of it so soft as to be inaudible beyond the immediate area of the bed, his chest rising and falling beneath the blankets in a pattern that had not varied appreciably in the several hours since he had fallen asleep, and his position had changed only slightly, his body making the minor adjustments that even deep sleep requires to prevent numbness or cramping, shifting an arm or turning slightly to one side or the other. Movements that occurred without waking him or disturbing the essential depth of his rest. The body's own intelligence operating independently of consciousness to maintain comfort and circulation and the proper alignment of joints and muscles. In the street outside, a cat moved along the base of the buildings opposite, its form barely visible as a darker shadow against the general darkness, moving with the peculiar silent intensity that characterizes cats on their nocturnal hunting, ears forward and tail low and eyes wide to gather what little light existed, and this cat paused occasionally to investigate some scent or sound that attracted its attention before moving on, continuing its patrol of territory it knew intimately through countless previous nights of similar wandering. The cat's presence went unnoticed by any human observer, no windows showing lights in any of the buildings it passed, and the cat itself paid no attention to those darkened windows, concerned only with its own purposes of hunting and patrolling and marking the boundaries of the space it claimed as its own. The night air that surrounded the buildings and filled the streets and alleyways between them carried a chill that would deepen further toward dawn, the temperature dropping to its lowest point in those hours just before sunrise, when the earth's stored heat had dissipated as fully as it would, and the sun's returning warmth had not yet begun to counter that loss. And this cold air pressed against the window glass of the workshop and the bookbinder's rooms, held outside by that thin barrier of glass and by the walls of brick and timber that enclosed the interior spaces, keeping them separate from the exterior cold, and allowing them to maintain the residual warmth left by the day's fires and lamps and human presence. The glass itself grew cold from contact with the outside air, cold enough that moisture from the interior would begin to condense on its inner surface as morning approached, forming small beads of water that would run down in tiny rivulets. But for now, the glass remained clear and dry, showing nothing but darkness on both sides, neither interior nor exterior visible through it in the absence of light. Time moved through its appointed course with the same steady patience it had shown since the evening began, neither hastening toward morning nor delaying its arrival, simply progressing at the rate that time progresses, which is to say at no rate at all, given that time itself is the measure by which rates are determined, time being both the thing that passes and the measure of its own passing, both the river and the gauge that marks the river's flow. And in this dual nature there was a kind of paradox that might occupy a philosopher's attention, but which made no difference to the clock in the workshop that continued its ticking, or to the sleeping bookbinder whose rest deepened or lightened according to its own rhythms, without regard for philosophical considerations about the nature of time itself. The darkness outside began to show the first faint suggestions of change, not yet a lightening that could properly be called dawn, but rather a subtle alteration in the quality of the darkness, a barely perceptible shift from the absolute blackness of deep night towards something fractionally less absolute, the kind of change that would not be noticed if one were watching for it, but which accumulated over time into the definite transformation from night to day. This change occurred in the eastern sky first, where the sun's approach below the horizon began to scatter light into the upper atmosphere long before the sun itself would become visible, and that scattered light gradually increased in intensity and spread across the sky, pushing the darkness westward in the same slow, inevitable way that darkness had earlier pushed the light. The cycle completing itself as it had completed itself every day since the world began and would continue to complete itself until the world ended. But the bookbinder knew nothing of this approaching dawn, his sleep continuing undisturbed, his body making no preparation yet for waking, simply resting in the depth of unconsciousness that the last hours of night provided, that final restoration before the return to activity that morning would bring. His breathing remained slow and deep, his heartbeat steady and calm, his muscles relaxed entirely except for the minimal tension required to maintain his sleeping position. And in this state of complete rest, his body performed its final hours of the night's restorative work, completing whatever processes it had been engaged in through the dark hours, preparing itself for the return to waking consciousness that would come soon now, but had not yet arrived. The workshop below remained in its state of patient waiting, the lamps still burning though their flames had diminished further as the oil in their reservoirs approached depletion. The light they cast grown fainter and more uncertain, flickering slightly in response to air currents too subtle to be felt but sufficient to disturb the diminished flames. The brass tools on the workbench had long since cooled to match the ambient temperature of the room, their heat entirely dissipated into the surrounding air, and they lay in their positions with the same inanimate stillness they had shown since being set there hours earlier, waiting to be taken up again when work resumed, when hands would grasp their handles and position their tips and press them in a leather in the same practiced motions that had been repeated thousands of times before and will be repeated thousands of times again. The volumes resting in the press continued their slow transformation under the steady pressure, the glue continuing its chemical journey from liquid to solid, the materials settling into final positions, the separate elements continuing to become unified wholes. And this transformation occurred in darkness and silence, and without any observer to witness it. The process requiring only time and pressure and the particular chemical properties of the glue to proceed towards completion. And these requirements were met by the press's patient grip and by the passage of the night hours and by the nature of the wheat paste adhesive that the bookbinder had prepared according to methods learned decades ago and refined through countless repetitions until the process had become as natural and automatic as breathing. In the street outside, the darkness began to retreat more noticeably now, the sky showing definite gray in the east, where earlier there had been only the faintest suggestion of change, and this gray spread gradually westward and upward, transforming the uniform darkness into a gradation of shades, darker overhead and lighter near the horizon. The entire dome of sky beginning to reveal its structure and depth where before there had been only flat blackness. The buildings opposite the workshop became visible as silhouettes, their roof lines showing dark against the lightening sky, their windows still dark because no lamps had been lit within them, their chimneys beginning to show smoke as early risers rebuilt their fires to warm their rooms and prepare their morning meals. The bookbinder stirred slightly in his sleep, some internal mechanism beginning the process of return to waking consciousness, though he did not wake immediately, but rather moved through the intermediate states between deep sleep and full wakefulness, his breathing changing its rhythm slightly, becoming less deep and more variable, his body making larger adjustments of position, an arm moving from one place to another, a leg shifting beneath the blankets, the small movements that marked the body's gradual re-engagement with conscious control. His mind moved through similar transitions, dreams beginning to form and dissolve in the borderlands between sleep and waking, fragmentary images and sensations that had no particular coherence or meaning, but which represented the mind's first stirrings toward the ordered thought that characterized waking consciousness. The gray light outside continued to strengthen, the eastern sky now showing distinct streaks of lighter color where before there had been only gradations of gray, and these lighter streaks spread and intensified as the sun approached the horizon from below, still invisible, but sending its light ahead to announce its coming. And the darkness that had held sway through the night hours retreated before this advance, withdrawing into the western sky and into the shadows of buildings and alleys, where it would persist for some time, yet before being entirely displaced by the full light of day. The workshop window began to show this growing light, the glass that had been completely dark now revealing faint shapes of the buildings opposite, and this light entered the workshop in gradually increasing amounts, adding itself to the diminished light of the oil lamps and beginning to illuminate the space with the different quality that natural light provides compared to lamplight, cooler and more even and less directional, spreading through the room rather than concentrating in particular areas. The bookbinder's eyes opened, though he did not move otherwise, lying still in his bed and looking at the dark rectangle of the window where the faintest suggestion of dawn light was beginning to show, and he remained in this position for several moments, not yet fully awake, but no longer asleep, resting in that transitional state while his mind oriented itself to the day and his body prepared itself for movement. The room around him was still dark, darker than the growing light outside because the interior spaces took longer to receive the dawn's illumination. But the darkness was no longer absolute, and he could begin to make out the shapes of the furniture, the washstand and the chest, and the doorway leading to the sitting room, all of them showing as darker masses against the general darkness of the walls. He had woken at approximately this hour every morning for more years than he could easily calculate, his body having learned the rhythm so thoroughly that it no longer required the assistance of any external alarm. Simply knowing when the appropriate time had arrived and beginning the process of waking without conscious decision or effort, and this morning showed no variation from any other morning in that regard. The waking occurring at its appointed time with the same quiet inevitability that characterized all the other rhythms of his days. He lay for a few moments longer, allowing the waking to complete itself, and then he pushed back the blankets and sat up on the edge of the bed, his feet finding the floor and his body adjusting to the upright position after the long hours of lying horizontal. The air in the bedroom was cold, noticeably colder than the warmth he had left beneath the blankets, and he reached for the clothes that waited on the chest, the same clothes he had removed the previous evening and which he would now put on again to begin the new day, dressing with the same methodical care he brought to all his activities, each garment pulled on properly and fastened securely before the next was taken up. The dressing completed, he moved to the washstand and performed the minimal ablutions that marked the transition from sleep to waking, splashing water on his face and drying it with the cloth that hung beside the basin. The cold water helping to drive away the last traces of sleep and bringing him more fully into the clarity of waking consciousness. From the bedroom, he passed into the sitting room, where the fire in the grate had burned down to barely glowing coals beneath their thick covering of ash, and he knelt before the hearth as he had done the previous evening, using the poker to disturb this ash and expose what remained of the fire's life, finding enough heat still present to serve as the seed for the morning's fire, if nurtured properly with small kindling and patient attention. He began this process, arranging the thin strips of wood over the exposed coals, allowing air to flow while concentrating the heat, watching as the coals responded by brightening slightly and beginning to ignite the kindling in small points that grew and spread and eventually caught in a visible flame. And he continued adding slightly larger pieces in careful progression until the fire had established itself and begun to throw heat into the room and light across its surfaces. The gray dawn light had strengthened further while he worked at the fire, the window now showing definite illumination from outside, and he could see without difficulty the room's contents and the doorway leading to the passage and the stairs that descended to the workshop below, where the day's work waited to be begun, where the brass tools rested on the workbench and the volumes waited in the press, and the completed covers lay between their boards. All of it ready for his return, ready for the resumption of the patterns that had been interrupted by evening's arrival and night's passage, and which morning's light would allow to continue again. The same patterns repeated day after day after day in their endless cycle of work and rest, making and finishing, beginning and completing. The cycle that had sustained him through decades of practice and would continue to sustain him for however many years or decades remained before his own cycle reached its final completion. And in that repetition, there was something that satisfied more deeply than novelty could satisfy, something that felt appropriate to human life and human work, the daily return to familiar tasks with familiar tools in familiar spaces. Creating useful objects through practice skill applied with patient attention to detail and quality, and the proper execution of each step in its proper sequence according to methods learned long ago and refined through countless repetitions into something approaching perfection, or at least approaching as close to perfection as human hands and human attention could bring them. He stood before the fire for a few moments longer, warming himself and watching the flames grow stronger as they consumed their fuel. And then he turned toward the doorway and the passage beyond and the stairs that descended through the building's darkness toward the workshop where another day's work waited to be begun. The passage lay in shadow still, the dawn light not yet having penetrated this interior space where no windows gave access to the outside, and the bookbinder moved through this shadow with the assurance of long familiarity, his feet knowing the floor's variations without requiring vision to guide them, his hand finding the stair rail without groping, the descent beginning in the same unhurried way that characterized all his movements, steady and deliberate and without waste of effort or attention. The stairs creaked softly under his weight, the wood settling and flexing as wood does when bearing a load, small sounds that had repeated every morning for decades and would repeat for decades more. The particular voice of this particular staircase in this particular building speaking its familiar language to anyone who knew how to listen. At the bottom of the stairs, the workshop door stood closed as he had left it the previous evening, and he lifted the latch and pushed the door open, stepping through into the space that would occupy most of his waking hours for the remainder of the day, the familiar smells of leather and paper and glue greeting him as they greeted him every morning. The workshop revealing itself in the combined light of the dawn coming through the window and the diminished flames of the oil lamps that had burned through the night and now guttered low in their reservoirs, their fuel nearly exhausted but still providing enough illumination to show the room's contents in soft detail. He crossed first to the lamps and extinguished them, turning down their wicks until the flames died and only the smell of burned oil remained, rising from the hot glass chimneys in thin wisps that dispersed into the general air of the workshop, and with the lamps extinguished the room relied entirely on the natural light from the window, which grew stronger moment by moment as the sun continued its approach to the horizon, the gray light becoming tinged now with the warmer tones that preceded. Full sunrise, pale yellows and soft oranges beginning to color the eastern sky and to reflect from the buildings opposite, giving them dimension and substance where earlier they had shown only as flat silhouettes. The bookbinder moved to the workbench where the brass tools still lay from the previous evening's work, and he gathered these and returned them to their drawer in the cabinet, each tool placed in its designated position among the others that occupied that space, the drawer closing with the soft sound of wood sliding against wood, and then he turned his attention to the window itself, unlatching it and pushing it open a few inches to allow fresh air to enter and displace the accumulated staleness of the night-closed room, the cold morning air flowing in and bringing with it the various smells of the city waking, smoke from chimneys and the distant scent of baking bread and the general humid smell that characterized London mornings when the air was still and damp from the night's condensation. The fresh air moved through the workshop in currents too gentle to be called drafts, stirring the papers that lay stacked on various surfaces and carrying away the concentrated odors that had built up during the closed night, and the bookbinder stood for a moment breathing this fresh air and looking out the window at the street that was beginning to show the first signs of morning activity. A shopkeeper across the way opening his shutters. A cart passing with its wheels rattling on the cobblestones, a boy walking quickly with a basket over his arm, probably carrying baked goods from some bakery to some customer who had ordered them for breakfast, the ordinary commerce of morning beginning its daily pattern. From the cabinet, he took the lamp chimneys that needed cleaning and carried them to the small sink in the back corner of the workshop, where he washed them with hot water from the kettle he had filled the previous evening and which had sat overnight near the bank coals of the sitting-room fire, warming slowly through the dark hours, and he used a soft cloth to remove the carbon deposits that had accumulated on the glass. Working with the same careful attention he brought to his bookbinding, ensuring that each chimney was cleaned thoroughly so that the lamps would burn cleanly and brightly when they were lit again for the evening's work. The clean chimneys he set aside to dry while he attended to the next morning task, which was the trimming of the wicks so that they would burn evenly and not smoke when the lamps were next used. This sequence of small maintenance tasks occupied perhaps 20 minutes, and by the time they were completed, the dawn had progressed to the point where full daylight filled the workshop, the sun having cleared the horizon and begun its climb into the morning sky, and the quality of light in the room had changed from the gray dimness of early dawn to the clear, bright illumination that would characterize the working day, allowing him to see colors accurately and details clearly, essential conditions for the kind of precise work that bookbinding required. He moved now to the press and opened its jaws, removing the 3 volumes that had rested there overnight and unwrapping them from their protective papers to examine the results of the night's pressing. The first volume he examined was a ledger, its signature sewn and its boards attached and its spine covered with brown calfskin, and he ran his hands over its surfaces, checking for evenness and proper adhesion, finding everything satisfactory, the glue having dried completely and the boards sitting flat and true, and he set this volume aside on the workbench where it would wait for the final steps of its completion, the application of corner pieces and perhaps a label on the spine. The second volume showed similar satisfactory results, and the third as well, all of them having benefited from a night's slow drying under steady pressure. And he returned them to the press, but with reduced pressure now, just enough to keep them flat while they waited for their next stages of work. The completed covers from the previous evening's tooling work lay between their boards on the shelf where he had placed them, and he removed these and examined them in the morning light, checking that the impressions had maintained their clarity and depth through the night, and that the leather had not relaxed or distorted in any way, finding everything as it should be, the borders crisp and even and the central designs properly placed and executed. And these covers would be ready later in the day to be attached to their text block, which had been sewn and prepared earlier in the week and which now waited in a cabinet drawer for this final assembly. He returned the covers to their resting place and turned his attention to planning the day's work, considering what tasks needed to be completed and in what order they should be approached, and he decided to begin with the assembly of the devotional volume whose covers he had finished the previous evening, that work being at a stage where it could be completed in a few hours and removed from the workshop's inventory, making space for the next commission to move forward in its progression from unbound pages to finished book. This decision made, he began gathering the necessary materials, taking the text block from its drawer and the covers from their shelf, and setting both on the workbench, along with the wheat paste he would need for adhering the end papers and the ribbons that would serve as page markers, and the various tools required for the assembly process. The workshop had warmed slightly as the morning progressed, the sun's light entering through the window and beginning to heat the air, though the temperature remained cool enough that the bookbinder kept his work jacket on, a heavy garment of dark wool that he wore during the cooler months and which bore the stains and were marks of decades of use. Small spots of glue and leather dye and other substances that had accumulated over years of work and which he made no effort to remove because they interfered in no way with the garment's function of providing warmth and protecting his other clothes from the inevitable soiling that accompanied bookbinding work. The street outside had grown busier as more people emerged to begin their daily activities, voices calling to one another and footsteps passing in both directions, and the general sounds of commerce beginning. Shops opening and vendors setting up their displays and customers making their morning purchases. In this background, noise entered through the open window and filled the workshop with the sense of the city's life continuing around it, though the bookbinder paid little conscious attention to these sounds, his focus having turned inward toward the work that lay before him, the assembly that would transform separate elements into a unified whole. He began by preparing the paste, taking a small amount from the larger pot he kept in a covered container and mixing it with a few drops of water to achieve the proper consistency, stirring it with a bone folder until it became smooth and even, without lumps or thick spots that might create uneven adhesion. And then he tested this paste on a scrap of paper to ensure that it was neither too thick to spread evenly nor too thin to provide adequate holding power, finding it satisfactory and setting it aside within easy reach on the workbench. The text block he positioned on a clean area of the bench, opening it to reveal the first and last signatures where the end papers would be attached. And these end papers he had prepared earlier from sheets of marbled paper in colors that complemented the green morocco of the covers, blues and greens swirling together in patterns that seemed to flow and shift when looked at from different angles. The application of paste to these end papers required care to ensure even coverage without using so much paste that it would seep beyond the edges or create wrinkles in the paper. And he worked with practiced efficiency, brushing the paste onto the paper's surface in smooth strokes that moved from the center outward, covering the entire area that would contact the text block and the inside of the cover. And then he positioned the end paper carefully against the first signature, aligning its edges precisely and pressing it down with gentle but firm pressure, using a clean cloth to smooth away any air bubbles and to absorb any excess paste that might have escaped the edges. The same process repeated for the final signature, and then the book was set aside for a few minutes to allow the paste to begin its initial setting before the next step of attaching the covers. While waiting for this initial setting, the bookbinder turned his attention to other small tasks that needed doing, sharpening the knife he used for cutting leather, a process that required a whetstone and oil, and the particular technique of holding the blade at the correct angle and moving it across the stone in long, smooth strokes that honed the edge without removing more metal than necessary. The knife being an expensive tool that needed to last for years and which could not be carelessly ground away through improper sharpening. The rhythmic sound of steel against stone filled the workshop, a steady scraping that continued for several minutes until the edge achieved the sharpness he required, which he tested by carefully drawing the blade across a scrap of leather and observing how cleanly it cut, finding the edge satisfactory and setting the knife aside with its edge protected by a piece of cork pressed over the blade to prevent accidental cuts or dulling. The end papers had set sufficiently now for the next step, and he took up one of the green Morocco covers and applied paste to its inner surface, working quickly but carefully to ensure even coverage, and then he positioned the text block against this cover, aligning the edges with precision and pressing the two elements together, feeling them make contact and begin to adhere, and he repeated this process for the second cover, bringing the entire assembly together into what would become the finished book once the paste had dried completely and the various elements had bonded into their permanent configuration. The assembled book was placed between pressing boards and returned to the press, which he tightened just enough to maintain contact between all the glued surfaces without applying so much pressure that paste would be forced out from the edges or the materials would be compressed beyond their proper thickness. And with this assembly completed and set aside to dry, the morning's first major task was finished, and he could turn his attention to the next item in the day's plan work, which was the preparation of signatures for a different volume, a collection of sermons that had been delivered to the workshop as loose printed sheets and which needed to be folded and gathered and sewn before they could proceed to the covering and finishing stages. This work of folding signatures was repetitive and rhythmic, each sheet being folded precisely along its center to create two leaves, and these folded sheets then being gathered in groups of 8 or 12, depending on the book's plan thickness and format. And the bookbinder moved through this work with the same steady pace that characterized all his activities, his hands performing the folding and gathering while his mind rested in the kind of partial attention that's such familiar work. Aloud, not thinking about anything in particular, but simply being present with the work, feeling the paper under his fingers and hearing its soft rustle as it folded, and watching the stacks of completed signatures grow on the bench beside him. The morning progressed through its appointed course, the sun climbing higher in the sky, and its light moving across the workshop floor as the angle of illumination changed, and the temperature in the room rose gradually as the sun's warmth accumulated and the cold of the night dissipated, until by mid-morning the bookbinder had removed his heavy jacket and worked in his shirt sleeves, comfortable now in the moderate temperature that the workshop maintained during the working day. Outside the window, the street continued its busy activity, people passing in both directions and carts delivering goods and shopkeepers calling to customers and the general noise of commerce filling the air. But within the workshop, these sounds registered only as a distant background murmur, present but not demanding attention, simply the ordinary soundtrack of a working day in the city. The folding and gathering of signatures continued through the late morning hours, the bookbinder pausing occasionally to rest his hands or to check the accuracy of his work or to attend to some small adjustment of materials or tools, but mostly working with continuous steady application, building the stacks of prepared signatures that would soon be ready for sewing, and in this repetitive work there was a quality of meditation, the hands moving through their practiced motions while the mind rested in quiet focus, not straining toward any goal beyond the completion of the task at hand, not anticipating the afternoon or remembering the morning, but simply existing in the ongoing present moment of folding and gathering and stacking, the work itself being sufficient occupation for both hands and attention. The clock on the wall marked noon with a single chime, a sound that registered in the bookbinder's awareness and caused him to pause in his work and consider whether this was the appropriate time to break for the midday meal that his landlady would have left for him upstairs. But he decided to continue working for another hour to complete the current batch of signatures before stopping, preferring to reach a natural conclusion point in the work rather than interrupting it in the middle of a sequence. And so he continued folding and gathering while the noon hour passed, and the sun reached its highest point in the sky and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. When the signatures were finally completed and stacked and counted and found to be the correct number for the volume being prepared, the bookbinder set them aside and covered them with a clean cloth to protect them from dust, and went upstairs to take his meal, climbing the familiar stairs with legs that were slightly stiff from the morning's hours of standing at the workbench, but which loosened and relaxed as he moved. And he emerged into the sitting room, where the midday light entered through the window and showed the room in different character than it had shown during the evening hours, brighter and more ordinary perhaps, but still familiar, and still his own space where he could rest briefly before returning to the afternoon's continuation of work. The meal waited on the table as expected, a portion of cold chicken and some bread and cheese and a bottle of small beer, and he ate this standing by the window, looking out over the yard behind the building, where pigeons moved about searching for whatever scraps they could find, and a cat sat on a wall washing its face with one paw. And he watched these small dramas of animal life while he chewed his food slowly and thoroughly, not hurrying even though he planned to return quickly to work. Simply eating at the pace that eating required to be done properly and to provide the nourishment his body needed for the afternoon's labor. The meal finished and the dishes rinsed and set aside, he remained standing by the window for a few moments longer, allowing his body to rest after the morning's work and before the afternoon's resumption, breathing the air that entered through the partially open casement and feeling the sun's warmth on his face and hands. And in these few moments of pause, there was a quality of simple contentment. Not happiness exactly, and certainly not excitement, but rather the deep satisfaction that comes from work proceeding well and life following its accustomed patterns, and the day unfolding as days should unfold, with work and rest alternating in proper proportion and the hours passing in their measured way toward evening's conclusion. Then he turned from the window and crossed to the doorway and descended once more to the workshop where the afternoon's tasks waited, the stairs creaking their familiar greeting under his feet, and he entered the workshop and crossed to the workbench and took up the next task in the sequence, which was the sewing of the signatures he had prepared that morning. And he set up the sewing frame with its cords tensioned properly and its height adjusted to allow comfortable working and began the process of sewing the gathered signatures onto these cords, the needle moving through the pre-punched holes and the thread following in its wake, creating the structure that would bind the pages together and allow them eventually to open and close without falling apart. The fundamental architecture of the book taking shape through the accumulation of these small, precise stitches. The afternoon proceeded through its appointed course as the morning had done, the light shifting across the workshop floor, the sounds from the street continuing their varied patterns, and the bookbinder worked steadily at the sewing frame, his hands moving through the familiar motions and his breathing staying even and unlabored, and the hours passed in their way toward the eventual arrival of evening, when the cycle would complete itself once more and he would finish the day's work and climb the stairs and eat his evening meal and sit before the fire with his book and eventually retire to bed to sleep through another night before waking to begin another day. the same pattern repeating endlessly in its way. And in that repetition was everything that he needed or wanted from life, the steady rhythm of work and rest, making and finishing, beginning and completing, day following night, following day, in their ancient pattern that had sustained human life since time began and would continue as long as time endured. And there was peace in that knowledge, a deep restfulness in the understanding that this was how life should be lived, simply and steadily and well, each day bringing its own work, and each work being done as well as it could be done, and that being enough, being entirely sufficient and entirely satisfying, requiring nothing more than what it was. The needle passed through the signatures in its rhythmic progression, entering at one station and emerging at the next, the linen thread following behind and being pulled taut with careful measured force, enough to create firm attachment without distorting the paper or straining the thread beyond its capacity. And the bookbinder's hands performed these motions with the unconscious precision that came from having repeated them countless thousands of times over the decades of his practice. The fingers knowing exactly how much tension to apply and exactly when to release, and exactly where the needle should enter to maintain the straight alignment of the sewing that would support the book structure through years or decades of use. The sewing frame held the cords at their proper tension, the horizontal supports keeping them parallel and evenly spaced. And as each signature was sewn onto these cords, it was pressed down firmly against the ones below it, creating a solid text block that would eventually be trimmed and rounded and backed and covered to become a finished volume, but for now existed simply as a growing stack of sewn gatherings, their pages still untrimmed and therefore slightly uneven at the edges, showing the decal that characterized handmade paper and which would be removed later when the edges were cut to create the smooth surfaces that readers expected from a properly finished book. The afternoon light that entered through the window had taken on the warmer tones that characterized the hours between midday and evening, the sun having passed its zenith and begun its descent toward the western horizon, and this warmer light moved slowly across the workshop floor as the hours progressed, creating a traveling band of illumination that showed the wear patterns in the floorboards and the small accumulations of dust in the corners and the grain of the wood where it had been, exposed by decades of footsteps and the movement of furniture and equipment. All these details revealed by the particular quality of afternoon sunlight that differed from both the cool clarity of morning and the softer glow of evening. Outside the window, the street maintained its activity, though perhaps at a slightly reduced intensity compared to the morning hours, the initial rush of commerce having passed, and the afternoon settling into its own particular rhythm, and occasionally voices would rise in conversation or greeting or some brief exchange of business. And these voices would enter the workshop as indistinct sounds that registered without conveying specific meaning, simply the background presence of human activity, continuing around the isolated focus of the bookbinder's work. A dog barked somewhere in the near distance, a sharp sound that repeated several times and then ceased, and a cart passed with a distinctive rattle that suggested loose fittings in need of repair, and somewhere a door closed with a solid thump, and all these sounds occurred and faded and left no particular impression beyond their momentary presence. The sewing continued through the middle hours of the afternoon, signature by signature being added to the growing text block, each one sewn onto the supporting cords with the same careful attention to alignment and tension, and the bookbinder's posture at the sewing frame remained comfortable and sustainable, his back straight but not rigid, his arms positioned to allow easy movement without strain. His feet planted firmly on the floor to provide stable support, and in this position he could work for hours without fatigue, the body having learned over decades how to position itself for this particular task and how to maintain that position without creating unnecessary tension or wasted effort. The thread in his needle required periodic renewal as it was consumed by the sewing, and when he reached the end of a length, he would tie off the old thread and begin a new one, these transitions happening smoothly without interrupting the overall rhythm of the work. And the small knots where old thread met new were positioned carefully at points where they would not interfere with the book's eventual functioning or create visible irregularities in the sewing pattern, these small details being part of the larger attention to quality that characterized all his work, nothing done carelessly or thoughtlessly. Every element considered and executed properly according to the standards he had learned as an apprentice and maintained through all the years of his practice. Halfway through the afternoon, the sewing was completed, the final signature attached, and the thread tied off and trimmed, and the completed text block was removed from the sewing frame and examined for evenness and proper tension. The bookbinder running his hands over the spine and feeling the cords beneath the sewn signatures, checking that everything was as it should be, that no signatures had been missed or sewn out of sequence, that the alignment was straight and true, and finding all these aspects satisfactory, he set the sewn text block aside and began the process of preparing it for the next stages of its construction. This preparation involved first the application of a thin layer of glue to the spine, worked carefully into the spaces between the signatures to help hold them firmly in their sewn positions while still allowing the book enough flexibility to open properly. And he mixed this glue from wheat paste and a small amount of animal glue, creating a consistency that would penetrate the spaces without being so thin as to run into the pages themselves, and he applied this mixture with a brush, working it into the spine with careful attention to ensure even coverage and proper penetration. And then he set the text block under light pressure between boards to allow the glue to begin its initial setting before the next steps could be undertaken. While waiting for this setting, the bookbinder turned his attention to the press where the devotional volume he had assembled that morning continued its drying, and he opened the press to check its progress, finding that the paste had dried sufficiently for the book to be removed and examined, and he took it out and inspected the joints where the covers met the text block, finding them properly adhered and showing no gaps or irregularities, and the end papers had bonded smoothly to both the text block and the covers without wrinkling or buckling, and the overall construction appeared sound and well executed, requiring only the final addition of a spine covering to complete its transformation into a finished volume ready for delivery to its owner. The preparation of this spine covering occupied the next portion of the afternoon, the bookbinder selecting a piece of the same green Morocco leather that covered the boards and cutting it to the appropriate dimensions, allowing enough material to cover the spine itself and to extend onto the boards in a band that would be tucked beneath the leather already adhered there, creating a continuous surface that would protect the spine and provide both structural support and visual unity to the completed binding. The cutting of this leather required precision, the knife following a straight edge to create edges that were perfectly straight and parallel, and the bookbinder worked with the same careful attention he brought to all cutting operations, knowing that errors at this stage could not easily be corrected and would compromise the quality of the finished work. The leather cut to size, he pared its edges thin using a curved knife designed specifically for this purpose, removing material from the flesh side of the leather in long, smooth strokes that graduated the thickness from full strength in the center to paper thin at the edges, this thinning being necessary to allow the edges to tuck smoothly beneath the board covering without creating visible ridges or bumps that would mar the book's appearance and feel. And the paring required both skill and attention, the knife needing to be held at precisely the correct angle and moved with exactly the right amount of pressure to remove the desired thickness without cutting through the leather entirely or leaving an uneven surface. With the spine leather prepared, he turned his attention back to the text block that had been waiting under pressure, and he removed this from between its boards and examined the spine where the glue had set, finding it firm enough to proceed to the next stage, which was the rounding and backing of the spine to create the characteristic shape that would allow the book to open properly and to sit correctly when shelved. This rounding was accomplished through careful manipulation of the text block, working it with his hands and with a special hammer designed for the purpose, gradually coaxing the spine into a gentle convex curve while the foredge took on a corresponding concave shape, and this process required both strength and delicacy, enough force to move the materials but not so much as to damage them or create irregularities in the curve. The rounding completed to his satisfaction, he placed the text block in a backing press, a device that held it firmly while allowing access to the spine, and he used his backing hammer to create the shoulders at either side of the spine, these being the raised portions that would eventually fit into the grooves in the covers and provide the mechanical joint that allowed the book to open and close smoothly, and the hammer fell in measured rhythmic blows. Not heavy strikes, but firm taps that gradually moved the material into its desired position, creating clean, even shoulders that ran the full length of the spine on both sides. These operations occupied perhaps an hour of concentrated work, the bookbinder moving between different tools and techniques as each stage of the process required. And when the backing was completed, he removed the text block from the press and examined it critically, checking that the shoulders were even and properly positioned, that the spine maintained its curve without distortion or irregularity. And finding everything satisfactory, he set this text block aside to await the application of its spine covering, which would happen later after he had attended to some other pressing tasks that required completion before the day's end. The afternoon had progressed now into its later hours, the sun having descended far enough that its light no longer entered directly through the workshop window, but rather illuminated the street and buildings opposite, which reflected this light back into the workshop in a softer, more diffuse form that lacked the intensity of direct sunlight, but still provided adequate illumination for work. And this indirect light would continue for another hour or perhaps slightly more before giving way to the dimness that would require the lighting of lamps to continue working, and the bookbinder was conscious of this approaching transition and of a need to complete certain tasks while the natural light remained sufficient. He turned his attention now to a small repair job that had been brought to the workshop several days earlier, a family Bible whose spine had separated from its covers through years of use and whose sewing had broken in several places, allowing some of the signatures to come loose. And this repair required careful disassembly of the damaged areas, removal of old glue and broken thread, resuing of the loose signatures, and reattachment of the spine, all operations that needed to be performed. With particular delicacy, given the age and fragility of the materials and the sentimental value that such books typically held for their owners. The disassembly began with careful examination of the damage to understand exactly what had failed and what remained sound, and the bookbinder worked slowly and methodically, removing only what needed to be removed and preserving everything that could be preserved, his fingers working gently to separate glued surfaces without tearing the paper or leather. And as he worked, he could see the traces of earlier repairs. Places where some previous bookbinder had addressed similar problems, probably decades ago, using methods and materials that differed slightly from those he would employ, but which showed the same fundamental understanding of the book structure and the same desire to preserve it for continued use. This connection to previous craftsmen, this sense of being part of a long tradition of people who had performed similar work in similar workshops using similar tools and materials, gave the bookbinder a quiet satisfaction that he rarely articulated, but which formed part of his fundamental understanding of his place in the world. Not as an isolated individual, but as a link in a chain that extended backward into history and forward into whatever future awaited, and the work he did connected him to both past and future in ways that transcended the immediate task of binding or repairing any particular book, making him part of something larger than himself, something that had existed before his birth and would continue after his death. The afternoon moved toward its conclusion, the light outside beginning to fade more noticeably now, the indirect illumination giving way to a general dimness that made detailed work increasingly difficult, and the bookbinder paused in his repair work to light the oil lamps, trimming their wicks and filling their reservoirs from the can of lamp oil he kept in the cabinet, and then striking a match and touching it to each wick in turn, watching the flames catch and grow steady, and replacing the glass chimneys that would protect the flames and direct their light downward onto the work surfaces where it was needed. The lamps lit. The workshop took on the different character that lamplight created, warmer and more enclosed than it appeared in natural light, the corners falling into deeper shadow, and the work area becoming a bright island in the surrounding dimness. And this transformation happened every evening and marked the transition from the day's main working hours into the final period before closing, when tasks in progress were brought to conclusion points and preparations were made for the next day's work, and the workshop was gradually put into order for the night ahead. The repair work on the Bible continued under lamplight, the bookbinder's hands moving through the careful operations of resuing and regluing, working with extra attention now because the reduced light made it easier to miss small details or to misalign elements that needed precise positioning, and he worked more slowly than he might have in full daylight, taking time to check each step carefully before proceeding to the next. And the repair progressed satisfactorily toward its completion, which would probably require another day or two of work, but which had advanced significantly during this afternoon session. Outside the window, the street had grown quieter as businesses closed for the evening and people returned to their homes for supper and rest. The day's commerce winding down in the same gradual way it wound up each morning, and the sounds that entered the workshop were fewer now and more intermittent, footsteps passing occasionally and voices calling brief farewells, and the rumble of a late cart making its way towards some stable or warehouse. And these sounds had a different quality in the evening than they had possessed during the day, somehow more isolated and distinct because they occurred against a background of increasing quietness rather than continuous activity. The bookbinder worked through the final hour of the day, bringing the Bible repair to a point where it could be safely set aside until tomorrow, and completing several other small tasks that needed attention. And as he worked, he was aware of the day's gradual movement toward its conclusion, the familiar rhythm of activity slowly decreasing, energy being conserved rather than expended. The focus shifting from production to completion and preparation, and the putting away of tools and materials in their proper places so that tomorrow's work could begin efficiently without time wasted searching for items that should have been returned to their designated locations. The tasks completed, he began the process of closing the workshop for the night, wiping down the workbench and sweeping the floor and returning tools to their drawers and covering work in progress with clean cloths to protect it from dust and checking that nothing remained in positions where it might be damaged or cause damage if disturbed during the night. And these small acts of maintenance and preparation were performed with the same attention to proper method that characterized all his work. Nothing done carelessly or hurried, even though the day was ending and rest waited upstairs, because maintaining the workshop in good order was itself part of the craft and deserved the same respect as any other aspect of the work. The sweeping completed and the tools put away and the work covered and protected, he stood for a moment looking around the workshop in the lamplight, checking that everything was as it should be, that the space was ready to be left for the night and ready to receive him again in the morning when the cycle would begin once more, and finding everything satisfactory, he moved toward the lamps to turn them down to their night-burning level, leaving just enough flame to keep the oil from congealing, and to provide a small amount of light against the complete darkness. And with the lamps turned down, the workshop settled into its nighttime state. The familiar shapes and shadows that he had seen thousands of times before and would see thousands of times again, each night bringing the same transition from active work to quiet waiting, from illuminated activity to shadowed rest. He crossed to the door and passed through it into the passage and began climbing the stairs toward his rooms, his footsteps creating their familiar sounds on the wooden treads, and behind him the workshop held its quietness, the low lamps burning their patient vigil, the tools resting in their places, the press standing solid and dark, the work waiting under its protective coverings for tomorrow's continuation. And in this waiting, there was the same quality of peace that characterized all the rhythms of his life, work and rest alternating in their proper proportions, activity and stillness following one another in natural sequence, day giving way to night, giving way to day in the endless pattern that sustained all life and all craft and all the ordinary human activities that filled the hours between birth and death with purpose and meaning and the quiet satisfaction of work done well. The stairs rose through the dimness, and the bookbinder climbed them with the slow, deliberate pace of a man whose body carried the accumulated fatigue of the day's labor, but whose mind rested in the satisfaction of work completed properly. And he reached the upper landing and moved along the passage to his sitting room, where the fire he had built that morning had burned down to coals again, waiting to be revived for the evening's warmth. And he knelt before the hearth and performed the familiar ritual of feeding these coals with kindling and small pieces of wood, watching the flames emerge and grow and begin to push back the chill that had settled into the room during the afternoon hours. The evening meal waited on the table, left there by his landlady while he worked below, and he ate standing by the fire, chewing slowly and thoroughly, not tasting the food with any particular attention, but receiving its nourishment gratefully, his body recognizing what it needed after the day's expenditure of energy. And when the meal was finished, he rinsed the dishes and set them aside and took his usual chair before the hearth, settling into it with a small sigh that marked the true completion of the day's activity and the beginning of rest. The book from the previous evening lay where he had left it on the small table beside the chair, and he took it up and opened it to the marked place and began to read in the firelight, the words moving past his attention in their measured progression, describing woodland birds and their habits, and the trees where they nested and the foods they consumed, and he read without urgency or particular engagement, simply allowing the text to occupy his awareness while his body relaxed more completely. Into the chair's support and the fire's warmth worked its way into his muscles and bones, easing the small aches that accompanied any day of physical work and preparing him gradually for the sleep that would come in its appointed time. The fire burned steadily, consuming its fuel in the ancient chemical transformation that had warmed human dwellings since fire was first domesticated, and the flames cast their moving light across the room's surfaces, creating shadows that shifted and danced in response to the fire's variations, and the bookbinder read through several pages, his eyelids growing heavier as the evening progressed. The weight of the day's accumulated fatigue making itself felt now that activity had ceased and rest had begun, and eventually he closed the book and marked his place with the ribbon and set it aside, rising from the chair to attend to the final preparations for sleep. The bedroom waited beyond its doorway, cool and dark, and he moved through the familiar sequence of undressing and washing and pulling on his nightshirt. These actions performed almost without conscious thought, the body knowing what came next and executing each step in its proper order. And when these preparations were complete, he extinguished the candle and climbed into the bed, feeling the mattress settle beneath his weight and the blankets provide their covering warmth, and he lay on his side facing the window where darkness pressed against the glass, and his breathing deepened and slowed as sleep approached in its gradual, inevitable way. In the workshop below, the lamps burned their quiet vigil, their small flames patient and constant through the night hours, and the tools rested in their drawers, and the press stood solid against its wall, and the work waited under its coverings for tomorrow's light, and the window looked onto the empty street where no one now passed, and everything held its proper place in the darkness and the stillness, waiting through the night hours for morning to come and the cycle to begin again, the same pattern that had repeated for decades and would repeat for decades more, work and rest, making and finishing, day following night following day, in the endless rhythm that sustained all craft and all human endeavor. And in that rhythm was everything necessary, everything sufficient, everything complete. The bookbinder's breathing settled into the deep, regular pattern of sleep, and his consciousness released its hold on the day's events and the workshop's details and the book's descriptions and all the various contents of waking thought, drifting instead into the different realm where sleep conducted its mysterious restorations, and the night held him in its darkness as it held the workshop in its stillness. Both the sleeping man and the quiet space resting in the peace that comes when work is done and done well, when effort has been properly expended and rest has been properly earned, when the day has followed its natural course from beginning to conclusion and the night can unfold in its own time without hurry or disturbance, carrying everything gently toward the morning that would come in its appointed hour, bringing light and warmth and the beginning of another day's work in the endless succession of days that composed a life well lived. And so the bookbinder slept, and the workshop waited, and the night held both in its patient embrace, and time moved forward in its gentle, inevitable way. And there was nothing more that needed to be done or said or thought, only this quiet resting in the completion of the day and the peace of knowing that tomorrow would bring its own work and its own satisfactions, the same pattern continuing as it had always continued, as it would continue for as long as such things endured. And in that continuation was all the meaning and purpose that any life required. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening with us at our bookbinding workshop. We hope the gentle rhythms of diligent work and peaceful rest have brought you some tranquility. If you found peace in these words, you might consider returning to this channel for other such gentle journeys to fall asleep. And if you wish, you can leave a silent message in the comments below. You can subscribe to our channel, but silence is equally welcome here. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.